In this video I'm going to look at a game I played last Tuesday in the 8th round of this year's Horsham Club Championship. I had the black pieces and was up against Ian Edgson. My opponent started with his customary c4 and I responded with the King's Indian formation. Knight f6, knight c3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles. Now, white has played all the standard King's Indian moves and now has to decide how to arrange his central pawns. He decided to play e3, intending to develop his knight on g1 to e2, and I responded with the standard King's Indian move d6, keeping open the option of playing e5 or c5 as seems appropriate. And after knight on g to e2, it was indeed time to choose between these two moves. Now, e5 is of course perfectly playable here, but I decided to go for c5 with a line of the symmetrical English. Play went castles, knight c6, and my opponent decided to go for the most ambitious move here, which is to play d4, which transposes to a sideline of the fianchetto King's Indian, where white has developed his knight to e2 rather than the more usual f3. Now, I decided to develop my bishop to d7 as this seemed the most flexible way to continue. Black has various ways of proceeding here, but he really wants to see what white intends. White decided to play the cautious h3, covering the g4 square, but this allowed black to play queen c8, hitting the pawn on h3. Now, white decided to defend it with king h2. And here, black chose a rather aggressive move in h5. And this is very double-edged. Black is looking to soften up the white king's side, but actually it could constitute a loss of time. Now, here, white played f4, which seems a bit weakening, but instead of that, d5 might have been actually quite strong. And this is where h5 could constitute a loss of time. If we go back to the position after king h2, if black had continued more conventionally with a6, looking for counterplay on the queen side with b5 after suitable preparation, then d5 isn't as effective, because after knight a5, b3, b5, black has immediate pressure on c4, which is rather awkward for white to deal with. And for this reason, after a6, b3 is better, although black can create counterplay with rook b8 intending b5. I think on reflection this would have probably been the best way for black to play objectively. Anyway, instead of a6, black played h5, but now d5 would have been more effective, because after knight a5, b3, black isn't in a position to play b5 immediately, but will have to play the preparatory a3. But then bishop b2 takes advantage of the extra tempo, because now b5 can be met by queen d2, and then b takes c4, which might seem to win a pawn, can be met by knight d1, hitting the knight on a5, and queen c7, protecting the knight, is met by bishop c3, attacking the knight a second time. And then after knight b7, there's no way to defend the knight further. White just plays b takes c4, and he seems to have consolidated his space advantage, and it's difficult to see how black is going to create counterplay. However, fortunately for black, white didn't go for d5, but rather chose f4, which, as I said, seems a bit weakening. The position is essentially the Leningrad Dutch with colours reversed, where the anti-Dutch side has only moved the d-pawn one square. Black continued with c takes d4, e takes d4, e5. This is the standard anti-Dutch break. It often ends up exposing the weaknesses in the Dutch formation. White decided to keep things as closed as possible with d5, but black now played the aggressive knight d4, offering a pawn. After f takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes d4 would not be a great idea, because after e takes d4, white cannot take the pawn with queen takes d4 because of knight g4 check winning the queen. So white instead decided to play b3, looking to bring the bishop on c1 to an active square. Black played knight f5, eyeing up the weaknesses in the white king side. The position is about level here, but now white commits a terrible blunder. Bishop a3. White overlooked that the e3 square is now undefended. Knight e3. Black wins material, although there are some technical obstacles to overcome. White can't now sacrifice his queen, because after bishop takes f8, knight takes d1, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, rook on a takes d1, bishop f5, black is clearly winning. So he had to give up the exchange with queen d3. Play went knight takes f1 check, rook takes f1, rook e8, c5. Now, white's central pawns, supported by his bishops, look dangerous, but black, for the moment, finds the best way to counter them. e4, a neat tactical blow, the point of which is demonstrated by the game continuation. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes h3, regaining the pawn, having weakened white's king side further. Now, the rook on f1 is attacked, so white has to move it, rook f2, and black decided to retreat the bishop to the more secure g4 square with bishop g4. White now had to try to create some play, so he went d6, aiming to put pressure on the f7 pawn. Now, this is where black let his advantage slip. He played queen d7, but this seems to actually be a waste of time, which white is able to exploit to gain sufficient compensation for the exchange. Instead, the active rook e5 looks very strong. So, for instance, knight f4, bishop f5 forces the light square bishops off, unless white tries d7, but then bishop takes d7 is obviously great for black. Alternatively, instead of knight f4, white could try bishop d5, but then black can simply play bishop e6, and bishop g2 is met by h4 when black takes the initiative. For instance, g takes h4, queen d8, queen g3, rook h5, and black regains the h-pawn with an obvious winning advantage because of his extra exchange and the somewhat exposed position of the white king. However, rather than rook e5, black played the less incisive queen d7, and after knight f4, white indeed seemed to have pretty decent compensation for the exchange. Now, after rook on a to c8, b4, white has good compensation for the exchange in the form of his queenside pawn mass. So black took a practical decision to give back the exchange with rook takes e4, eliminating one of white's strong bishops. And after queen takes e4, played rook e8, taking control of the e-file. Now, white needed to decide where to put his queen. d5 would have been the best choice. White puts pressure on both the black king side and queen side. On the king side, he's created the possibility of knight takes g6, exploiting the pin on the f-pawn. And on the queen side, he maintains pressure on b7. However, rather than putting the queen on d5, he played queen c4, which only puts pressure on the king side and not the queen side, and is therefore not as strong. Now, strongest for black would be the aggressive h4, and this would be based on the fact that knight takes g6 was not actually a threat, because black can now play h takes g3 check, and after king takes g3, rook e3 check, based on the point that king f4 is met by bishop h6 mate. So instead of knight takes g6, white would have to play g takes h4, but then rook e3 is very strong. However, black didn't realise that this was possible, and so played the more cautious king h7, meeting the threat of knight takes g6. However, this meant that white now had the opportunity to play bishop b2, swapping off one of black's bishops and leading to roughly equal chances. However, rather than seizing this opportunity, white pressed on with b4, advancing his queenside pawns. And again, black had the opportunity of playing h4, which would have given him an initiative, although it's not as strong as it would have been on the previous move. However, black was concerned about the advance of the queenside pawns and so played the more cautious a6. But now white did take the opportunity to swap off one of the bishops with bishop b2. And play went bishop takes b2, rook takes b2. Now, black could have played queen f5, intending h4 here, which would have been interesting, but play still should be roughly balanced. But instead, he played the direct h4, which is rather more hair-raising. Now, g takes h4, queen f5 gives black obvious compensation for the pawn. So white tried the aggressive, unchallenging knight d5 instead, threatening a deadly check on f6 and also a rather nasty looking tactic. However, this tactic proved to be somewhat illusory because after queen f5, white had queen takes g4, and if black simply played queen takes g4, then knight f6 check would lead to him being a piece up and clearly winning. However, after queen takes g4, which is what white played in the game, black doesn't have to take the queen, but can take the knight on d5. He could do this directly or after capturing first on g3. After queen takes d5, queen takes h4 check would be a serious mistake because of king g7 and the threat of rook h8 winning the queen, among other things, is not something that white is in a position to deal with. However, instead of taking the pawn on h4, white could simply play rook e2, challenging black's control of the e-file, and this would have been fine for him. However, rather than taking the knight on d5 straight away, black instead chose to play h takes g3 check, and after queen takes g3, queen takes d5. Here white let the draw slip. Queen b3 was the correct move when the game was likely to end in a draw. For instance, queen e5 check, king g2, queen g5 check, king f1, queen c1 check, king g2, queen g5, and the position repeats. However, instead of playing queen b3, white played queen g2, and after queen e5 check, it turned out that black was completely winning. Play went king g1, queen e1 check. Now, queen f1 wouldn't have worked. For instance, queen e3 check, queen f2, queen g5 check, queen g2, rook e1 check, king h2, queen e5 check, king h3, rook e3 check, king g4, queen f5 check, king h4, queen h5, mate. There are of course other possibilities, but that's a pretty good illustration of white's problems after queen f1. Instead of queen f1, white tried king h2. Black played king g7, introducing the possibility of rook h8 check. If rook b3, preparing to meet rook h8 check with rook h3, black simply has rook e2 winning the queen. So white played rook f2, and black continued with rook h8 check, king g3, queen e5 check, king f3, queen c3 check, king g4, f5 check. Now, neither of the possible king moves are any good for white, because king g5 is met with queen e3 check, rook f4, rook h5 mate, and king f4 is met with rook h4 check, king g5, queen f6 mate. So white had a choice. He could either resign or punt rook takes f5, with the idea that after g takes f5 check, he had king takes f5 check with a discovery, but after king f8, this isn't really going anywhere. Queen takes b7 might look a little scary, but it's easy to use the black queen and rook to force mate. Play went queen h3 check, king f6, rook h6 check, king e5, queen e6 check, king d4, rook h4 check. The black major pieces are methodically forcing the white king down the board to its doom. King c3, queen e3 check. Now, black mates in 3 moves at most, so white resigned.